Hello, everyone, and welcome to the apologetics show that makes no apologies, The Mentionables. I'm Joel Furchess.
I'm Caleb Johnston.
And I'm Clinton Wilcox.
Today on The Mentionables, religions all make some ridiculous-sounding claims, right? Right. Let's explore that. Also, by the pricking of my thumb, some other topic comes. But first, games!
Huzzah.
We took a vote, and we're turning to an old favorite, love song, worship song.
Joel, did you say love song, worship song?
Indeed I did.
Love song, worship song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
All right. Is everyone ready to play?
Ready?
All right, here are your first lyrics. I know that I don't bring a lot to the table, just little pieces of a broken heart. There's days I wonder if you'll still be faithful. Hold me together when I fall apart. Would you remind me now of who you are? Okay, those are the lyrics. Love song or worship song?
I'm going to go worship song on this one.
Okay.
I believe that's a worship song. I think I recognize it, but I couldn't tell you what the title is.
All right, the title is The Broken Beautiful by Ellie Holcomb. And indeed, it is a worship song. So, everybody got it right.
Sweet.
Let's move on.
I have absolutely no idea who that is, so it might have just been a song I heard in passing or something.
Could be. All right, your next lyrics. I've been listening in all the wrong places. Am I alone? Or am I missing every word you're saying? I don't hear the sound of your voice anymore. Speak to me, please. Speak to me. I'm in between and I can't hear you whisper. Shout it. Give me something. I need it now. I need your voice. Need the sound. Speak to me. Okay, those are your lyrics. Love song or worship song?
I'm going to go worship song on this one again.
I'm going to go worship song too.
Okay, the name of the song was Speak to Me by Remedy Drive, and that is indeed a worship song.
Yeah, Remedy Drive is a worship band, definitely.
All right.
All right.
I hadn't heard that
Both
song.
doing well this time. Your next lyrics. I remember the moment. I remember the pain. I was only a girl, but I grew up that day. Tears were falling. I know you saw me, hiding there in my bedroom, so alone. I was doing my best, trying to be strong. No one to turn to. That's when I met you. Love song or worship song?
I'm going to go love song on this one.
Yeah, I second that.
Not confident, though.
All right. The song is All This Time by Britt Nicole, and that is indeed a love song.
Oh, okay.
All right. That is 3 out of 3 for everyone. Pat yourselves on the back because you won this round of love song, worship song.
Very nice.
All right. So today I'm going to go ahead and launch into my section. We're going to be talking about the outsider test by John Loftus. This is something that we talked about in the early days of the show quite a bit. We even do a little segment called Outside Testing where we talked about some ridiculous mythology and then tried to compare it to Christianity. Before I launch into that, Clinton, you said you had recently read the Outsider Test. Did you want to kind of fill us in on what that is?
Not recently. It's been a while since I've read it. I own the book. It's on my bookshelf.
Okay.
So, and I wanted to review it before the podcast tonight. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to do that. But if I remember correctly, essentially what John Loftus is trying to get the outsider test to do is to say, you know, you as a Christian find all of the arguments for God convincing because you're already a Christian. Well, in order to decide, in order to really know whether or not Christianity is true, you need to step outside Christianity and kind of put yourself in the shoes of an atheist and say, if I were an atheist, would I find these arguments convincing? And so he basically says that in order to discover whether or not your religion is true, you need to look at it as an outsider and basically go from there. I couldn't tell you any more of the nuances because, like I said, it's been a while since I've read it, but I think that's the gist of it.
Yeah, so every time I've heard this argument explained, the basic explanation that I hear is that, I, as a Christian, use particular arguments to defeat another religion. And he says that if I were to turn those arguments around and fire them back on myself, they backfire and they would diffuse or debunk Christianity as easily as they debunk the other religion.
Yeah, John Loftus, to put it nicely, he's not the most sophisticated of atheist thinkers, and and this just kind of is just one example of that. In that, you can't just turn an argument around and have it refute Christianity. Because, for example, if like he would say, probably like the miracle claims. Well, if we look at the miracle claims of, say, Islam, then whatever test we would use to disprove the miracle claims could be turned around and used to disprove Christianity. But that's because Loftus already comes at it with the assumption that miracles can't happen. But as a Christian, we can say it's possible the miracle claims of Islam or Hinduism or whatever are true, but so we can develop a test to test these miracle claims and then see if they pass muster. And using that same test, the miracles of Christianity would pass, as opposed to the miracle claims of other religions. So it's just not the case that these arguments can be turned around and used against the Christian.
Yeah, so I mean, the notion always seemed flawed to me, because it seems to say that if you've debunked one religion, you've debunked all of them. Like, the work just needs to be done once, and then you don't have to do any work anymore. Right.
And another aspect of the outsider test is, this whole idea that if you were, born in Saudi Arabia, you'd most likely be a Muslim. If you were born in China, you'd most likely be a Buddhist. This kind of idea that where you're born kind of dictates what you would most likely be. And so, yeah, I mean, at the bottom, it's the problem of other religions, right? Because it says that,
what you were just saying, and then they do the whole atheist slogan, we're all atheists, I just go one God further,
right.
Which, again, is just saying that, you've got to take your atheism of Thor and turn it back around, and you realize that you're just as atheist, if you apply that to God or something like that.
Right, but the problem is, I don't believe in superheroes, and the Greek pantheon of gods are essentially just superheroes. They're not analogs to the God of Christianity, Yahweh, or the God of any of the three major theistic religions.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of sophistication going on in the thinking of that, because it doesn't even disambiguate against among the various gods and their attributes. It just equates all religion to the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to re-examine this argument because I think that we may have misunderstood it. And either that or there are different versions of the argument. And one of those versions I would like to examine now. So if you've ever heard John Loftus debate, have you ever heard him debate?
Yeah. His debate, he did a debate with David Wood. His debate showing was pretty poor. But David Wood's opening statement is my all-time favorite opening statement of any that I've ever heard, even considering all of the debates by William Lane Craig that I've watched. David Wood's opening argument was superb, stupendous. So
yeah.
Well, I know what I'm doing when we end this stream.
In that debate, I actually got to hear the outsider test in practice, and it was a lot different than what I had always imagined it to be. It wasn't the use this argument against yourself tactic that I thought it was. Here's what he does. He takes some sort of Bible story or Christian doctrine, then he retells it as if it were coming from another religion, and then he concludes with, see how ridiculous that sounds? Or he'll compare some Christian claim to a similar claim from another religion, and say, see how ridiculous that sounds? So ultimately, the outsider test isn't so much about applying rational arguments across the board. It basically boils down to the argument from incredulity. What he's trying to do is to get you to step outside your belief, have you see how stupid they look from an outsider perspective, and then reject them because they sound stupid. All right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I'm already kind of aware, though, how ridiculous some of Christianity's views appear to atheists. You know, I don't think any Christian thinks that, everything in Christianity, like the talking snake in the Garden of Eden, or all languages coming from the Tower of Babel, and all these things, or Jonah and the great fish, or Noah and the ark. I don't think anyone thinks that these sound reasonable to atheists.
No, of course not. I'd like to kind of give an example of this in action in a practical sense. So, Caleb, you have that video you could queue up?
Yeah, sure thing. We gonna play the whole thing, or you want me to stop part way through, sir?
Whole thing.
All right, here we go.
BC, everyone is completely bad and evil. Man, woman, child, infant, fetus. And God came to Lehi and he said, put your family on a boat and I will lead you out of here. And God did lead them. He led them to America. I said, America? From Jerusalem to boat in 600 BC? And they said, yes. Then it told me how Lehi and his descendants reproduced, and over the course of 600 years, there were two great races of them, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Nephites were totally, totally good, each and every one of them, and the Lamanites were totally bad and evil, every single one of them just bad to the bone. After Jesus died on the cross for our sins, on his way up to heaven, he stopped by America and visited the Nephites. And he told them that if they all remained totally, totally good, each and every one of them would win the war against the evil Lamanites. But apparently somebody blew it, because the Lamanites were able to kill all the Nephites, all but one guy, this guy named Mormon, who managed to survive by hiding in the woods. And he made sure this whole story was written down in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics chiseled onto golden plates, which he then buried near Palmyra, New York. Well, I was so into this story, I was just on the edge of my seat. Said, what happened to the Lamanites? And they said, well, they became our Native Americans here in the U.S. And I said, so you believe the Native Americans were descended from a people who were totally evil? And they said, yes. Then they told me how this guy named Joseph Smith found those buried gold plates, basically right in his backyard. And he also found this magic stone back there that he put into his hat and then buried his face into it. And this allowed him to translate the gold plates from the Reformed Egyptian into English. Well, at this point, I just wanted to give these two boys some advice about their pitch. Okay, don't start with this story. I mean, even the Scientologists know to give a personality test before they start telling people all about Xenu, the evil intergalactic overlord. Okay, so I initially felt really superior to these boys and smug in my more conventional faith. But then the more I thought about it, the more I had to be honest with myself. If someone came to my door and I was hearing Catholic theology and dogma for the very first time, and they said, we believe that God impregnated a very young girl without the use of intercourse, and the fact that she was a virgin is maniacally important to us, and she had a baby, and that's the Son of God, I mean, I would think that was equally ridiculous. And
Okay, so that tells me exactly what I'm talking about. Reactions?
Well, I mean, the immediate reaction I have is that there are some very important differences in the account of the Book of Mormon and in the Bible. And that number one, the Bible is actually set in historical areas. This whole story about Lehi and his followers going by boat to America. Number one, is not really possible. Because there's a lot of land in between, so you can't take a boat directly from there to there. But even then, there's absolutely no historical evidence that this ancient civilization lived in America, or that the Native Americans were descended from these people. Whereas in the Scripture, especially in the Gospels, these are based in historical settings, and these people, there's actual evidence that these people lived. It's based around historical figures like Pontius Pilate and other figures from that era, and plus the Gospels. There is a basically a line of manuscripts that we can go back to show that there are very early manuscripts that show that basically most of what is recorded in Scripture was faithfully passed down and reproduced, whereas these alleged golden plates, there's absolutely no evidence that they ever existed. So I think that we can actually make a historical case that the gospel stories are at least more reliable than the stories from the Book of Mormon. Now, of course, a story like a virgin birth, well, I'm not going to talk to an atheist about the virgin birth, because I believe it happened, but I don't see how I'm going to convince them it happened until I can first convince them that there's a God who can actually work miracles. So that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. But I think that we do have an advantage over the Mormons in that we have actual historical evidence of these people and places, and we also have the early manuscripts that is also lacking from the Mormons, whereas there's absolutely no evidence that these golden plates ever existed, because they were, allegedly taken up into heaven after Joseph Smith did his translations.
How about you, Caleb? Any reactions?
I'm thinking to myself right off that, it makes for some interesting comedy, but if you pluck the most suspension of disbelief topics from a religion and chain them together in such a way as to make it absurd, you can do that with anything. Even things that are very, very logical or very scientifically backed, you can still take some of the most ridiculous elements of that claim, chain them together, and you could make a comedy bit from it, no matter what it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that it's couched in comedy has some relevance, I suppose, to how she's presenting it. But at any rate, I mean, she did a fairly decent job of, portraying the Mormon account. And then really the only correlative story she gave was the virgin birth. I don't know whether or not anyone affirms that, but assuming they did. Yeah, it's too bad he never watches these videos.
Right. Oh, well. Yeah, we need to get him on one of these podcasts.
Yeah, we really should. But at any rate, for our podcast listeners, I'll just interrupt myself and say that now we're doing the podcast as a video, typically on Sunday nights, right, Caleb?
Yep. So now we're really trying to give them the most bang for their buck. So if they want to watch live, great. You can watch the live stream. You get to see some video content. We'll also have this as a podcast, of course, down the road. So if you prefer the post-production version, that's great too.
All right. So at any rate, one of the things, a previous podcast we recently did, we were talking about God being a liar. And one of the stories we pulled out was, a bunch of prophets coming before a couple of kings that were going to war. And, one of them tells about this heavenly council he had a vision about. And, at the time, I mentioned that as an apologist, I tend not to go into the Old Testament for exactly this reason. Because you kind of end up having to literally apologize for the stories because they sound very out there, and you don't have, unlike the Gospels, where there is a lot of documentary evidence and of other historical accounts from the same time period that corroborate them. You don't get that with the Old Testament. And you tend to get a lot larger miracle claims and so forth in the Old Testament, which we can't provide a lot of evidence for. So at that point, they kind of end up breaking down and sounding a lot like what you would get from the Mormons, right?
Yeah.
True.
So you can see how this argument, to some extent, especially if you pick and choose the Bible stories that you're looking for, can be pretty effective, at least on the emotional level. It's this argument from incredulity. It sounds ridiculous. Therefore, it might be ridiculous.
Yeah, it packs emotional punch for people just to be hit with that, especially from either a stranger or maybe somebody you know, and be punched with something that you're not thinking about on a daily basis. It may not be something you've studied in any depth. It may not be, something you even actually read yourself in the Bible. So, it's going to pack an emotional punch when people throw these things at you in that shape and form.
And to a degree, I mean, you hear this all the time that, I'm an atheist because I read the Bible, right? And I imagine this at least has something to do with that. This idea that, if you really knuckle down and read through the Bible accounts, it all starts to sound pretty ridiculous. And then we're kind of placed in the position of having to defend that.
Yeah, you see that more and more these days.
Yeah. And we've been talking about Old Testament versus New Testament. And again, the New Testament tends to come together and sound more reasonable, if for no other reason than you've got historical evidence. And, just an aside on that point, there is a lot of archaeological evidence that backs up at least some of the historical elements of the Old Testament. Although things as important as the Exodus, you often hear that there's no historical, archaeological or historical evidence to support the Exodus, which would be problematic.
True. If that were the case, there are different theories on that, and there is some evidence that I personally find compelling. Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, in the New Testament, you've got at least some points that you end up having to stumble over yourself defending. And one that I frequently hear brought up is the passage in Matthew where he's talking about the dead saints rising at the event of Jesus' death and showing themselves around town.
Right.
And I don't hear a lot of apologists taking that account seriously or defending it historically. Generally, they try to explain the story using other means.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've heard, William Lane Craig talk about how it's not historically defensible because, it only appears in one place. It's not attested to by any of the extra biblical accounts, that kind of thing. But, he'll be quick to point out that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. It just means that that's one event that we can't really defend historically.
Well, there's another thing, as a Christian, our worldview allows us some latitude in, we don't have to reject a miracle claim right off the bat because that, our worldview allows that a miracle claim has some legitimacy. If we believe that God can do anything logically possible, that he exists, and that he occasionally acts inside our universe. But then that puts us in a point where we have to take these, miraculous or at the very least supernatural claims more seriously because our worldview doesn't prohibit them. So, to an extent, we might be more inclined to have to, to be compelled to investigate those claims.
Yeah, so God can do anything logically possible, which means he can't create a burrito so hot that even he can't eat it.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
Right. You have to put the logically possible in there because then, you get the questions like that or like, rock bigger than he can lift, that kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
But, at any rate, if we allow that anything logically possible, like, say, I don't know, a big fish eating a person and them surviving. That kind of thing.
Miraculous.
Yeah, miraculous. But then, I mean, if our worldview allows for that, when somebody, I don't know, says that they were taken by an entity to a extra dimension and, shown some, I don't know.
Hey, who
You
told
get
you
the
about
idea. Paranormal claims, for example. As a Christian, you'd almost be forced to take those more seriously than an atheist would, because an atheist dismisses that as easily as he does a Christian claim. But as for, say, the Mormon claims, we don't have the excuse of, we don't believe in the supernatural to just dismiss those claims.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It all depends on worldview as to how you're going to look at miracles. If you look at the world from a naturalistic perspective, you're going to reject them all off the bat, versus a Christian worldview that does allow for explanations for any number of supernatural events that may occur. Now, that doesn't mean, I would like to preface that it doesn't mean that a Christian's going to automatically accept a paranormal claim or a supernatural claim of some kind, coming at that with skepticism. And I would say that in a certain sense, Christians actually have more room for skepticism than a naturalist would, because a naturalist is already going to rule everything that happens as natural. So when you include a biogenesis along with any number of design elements in the world, you're saying that these things are going to line up this way, and you're eliminating the possibility that these random occurrences couldn't happen as frequently as they do. So in a sense, a Christian's going to have a little bit more room for skepticism on claims than a pure naturalist would, because of some of the elements that their worldview already drags in. So every worldview has its own baggage.
Right. This is something that G.K. Chesterton actually talked about in his book Orthodoxy, is that despite the claims of atheists, it's the Christians who are the real freethinkers. Because atheists, or at least the naturalistic atheists, by design, have to be skeptical about a lot of things, whereas Christians are open to consider the evidence and believe in them if the evidence leads that way.
All right. So what you're saying is we're free to investigate more claims rather than, being constricted to deny all things.
I don't know if I'd necessarily say investigate, because an atheist is free to investigate them, but just based on how open or closed your worldview is, the Christian is more likely to believe more true things than the atheist, because the Christian worldview is open to more possibilities than the atheist worldview is. Now, that doesn't, like Caleb was saying, that doesn't necessarily mean that being a Christian means you have to be gullible about miracle claims or about alien abductions or things like that. But we can at least remain open to the possibility.
Yeah. So one approach to this that I think, well, it's not that I think it works. I think it's how we operate, is that we've first, investigated the truth of Christianity, come to the conclusion that Christianity is true, and therefore, if we're rejecting outside claims to any degree, it might be because they don't align with those things we've already determined to be true via investigation. So, for instance, Mormonism, well, to a degree, but Islam especially, contradicts Christianity. And so if we've come to the conclusion Christianity is true, to an extent, we can, rule out Islam because it contradicts that which we've determined to be true through other means.
Right.
Right.
So, getting back to like the Old Testament stories, I distanced myself from the story on the truth episode, and I did that not so much because I think the story is untrue, but rather because I don't insist on its truth. The story doesn't need to be true in order for Christianity to be true. And I don't have any sort of evidence that it is true. Consequently, I can't defend the story, and I don't need to defend the story. True or not, Christianity remains. So what's my point in all this? My point is that the outsider test actually has some utility in apologetics, because it actually is important to be able to see how our religion sounds from the outsider perspective. Now, if a claim sounds ridiculous, does that make it false? Clearly, this is untrue. Practically every claim will sound ridiculous to someone if they're hearing it for the first time and it doesn't comport with their experience or, preconceptions.
I can think of one possible issue with that approach, in that I don't have any examples readily available, but if you take a claim from another religion and adapt it for another religion to say, doesn't that sound ridiculous? Well, it's possible that the nature of the original claim is such that if the claim is made in any other context, it would sound ridiculous, but made in the context of the religion itself, it doesn't sound ridiculous. So it seems like that we might run the risk of either strawmanning the position or basically ridiculing them for believing something that really isn't that ridiculous, taken in the context of their entire worldview.
Well, don't misunderstand me to be saying that we should, in fact, exercise the outsider test as writ. What I am saying is that it does allow us a better perspective on how we're making claims and the kinds of presentations that we're giving. If you can look at what you're saying and put your skeptic hat on and see how it sounds from that perspective, it might allow you to present it in, a way in which it's going to be taken more seriously, I guess. My point is, all right, so if I'm leading a Bible study, what I will do is I'll argue from the Bible. And I'll do that because everyone in that Bible study more or less accepts the Bible. But if I'm talking to anybody who's not a Christian, I argue to the Bible. I don't immediately take a verse and say, all right, so the Bible says blah, 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 and that means blah, blah, blah. Instead, I will say, all right, here are some principles we can agree on. In, using those principles, we can see how this claim of the Bible might have some validity to it. So I argue to the Bible, not from it, depending on my audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, if I were to say that we put a man on the moon, or the Earth orbits the sun, or lightning sometimes comes in the form of a sphere, and that a virgin can have a child, if you don't believe or know about those things, and then you hear them for the first time in your particular context, you're unlikely to believe them. And that's why we as apologists favor the modest claim over the more outlandish claim. Firstly, because the outlandish claims are more difficult to defend, and secondly, because outlandish claims are more likely to be rejected up front due to their outlandish nature. And then thirdly, because there tends to be a paucity of concrete evidence for the outlandish claim, and in cases such as Old Testament miracle claims, they don't need to be true for the most basic and essential truths of Christianity to remain intact.
Right. I would tend to agree with that.
Okay. Now, I want to make absolutely certain that our Christian listeners hear me correctly. I am not saying we should discard or reject some of the more fantastic stories in the Bible. What I am saying is that we consider how they sound when observed from the view of an outsider. That should inform our approach to both the stories and to the people hearing the stories.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Now, we've got a lot better archaeological evidence for the Bible than we do for Mormonism. In fact, of all the world religions, Christianity has more going for it from historical scholarship approaches. But nevertheless, I think we should prefer those claims which are both modest and defensible over those claims which tend to be more fantastic. But likewise, we call out the arguments from incredulity for what it is, an intuitive argument that shuts down rational inquiry in favor of emotional responses.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a recognized logical fallacy too. If someone presents an argument and you reject it because it just sounds too incredible to you, then that's obviously not a good response.
Yeah, and I think that there is room for arguing, looking at the argument as an incredulous, as a ridiculous argument in how it sounds, and then on that basis, look at how it can be defended from more acceptable evidence, if you will. All right, so that concludes my reconsideration of the outsider test. Any thoughts?
So, just to be clear, I think you lost me just a little bit there. Just to be clear, how do you think Christians should use this in kind of every day?
I don't know if Christians should use it in every day. I think it's important for apologetics more than anything else.
From
again,
from a personal standpoint, or from a presentation discussing with others standpoint.
Presentation discussing with others standpoint.
Okay.
Now, frequently, given the nature of what I do, if I'm sitting in church or Bible study or so forth, and I'm hearing somebody talk, they're arguing from the Bible. I mean, that's just the natural Christian thing to do. They get up, they read a text, they say, this is what the passage is saying, and this is why we should accept it, etc. And, given the nature of what I do, I'm often viewing it from the outside, if you will, as it would be taken by a non-Christian or skeptic. And then in my head, I'm arguing to the text, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
I'm sure you do that a little bit. I mean, you're in the same shoes as I am to a degree.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always important to be able to understand your listener or your discussion partner's point of view. If you're not able to understand it, and I think you've got to take a approach that looks at it from both the outside as well as the inside of the view, which I think is one of the points Clinton brought up earlier, as a lot of these things may make sense in the context of their wider theology. But if we take that view and we kind of look at it both ways, I think it helps us develop better questions to ask people, deeper conversations to have, that, get to the heart of the matter versus continuously beating around the same issues.
Yeah, and I think there might be some virtue. This is how I would tend to do it when I am, teaching in a Christian context, is I set myself up for whatever I'm teaching by arguing to the text. Then after I've done that, I argue from the text. And this might be just a little bit of preliminary work. I might not go into the full apologetic for it, but I build the foundation that I'm about to stand on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And partly that's instinctual because that's kind of what I do, in my regular life.
Right.
But to another degree, I think there's some use to that because, a lot of the, I study deconversion, right? And a lot of what happens, what you see happening is that this person emerges from a social context in which they've been instructed that, if it comes from the Bible, it's true by virtue of the fact that it comes from the Bible. And so, you see this in creationism a lot. Somebody sat me down once, and I was talking about how I'm kind of agnostic in specific views of creation. I can't defend a particular view of creation, therefore I don't take a position on it. And he responded by saying, well, are you denying that this word in the creation text means 24-hour day? And I'm like, you're not listening to me at all. And I realized that what he was doing was he was coming from this assumption that it's true because it's true. And if you can kind of just show what the biblical text is saying, then the person has to accept that it's true because it was coming from that biblical text, which is all fine and well from his perspective, but that's not something that would be accepted for most of the people we talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, my point in saying all that is in these deconversion stories, you come from that perspective that if you really can understand the text, you know the truth, and then you go into a context where you're surrounded by people who don't believe that in the first place. They don't believe the Bible in the first place. And suddenly your eyes are kind of open to this outsider test. You're now seeing the stuff from the outside, how it's seen by everyone else. And by virtue of nothing but peer pressure, you come to the conclusion that you've kind of been deluded all your life.
Yeah. And, I think that another purpose for this kind of action is also in terms of looking at and really understanding your own beliefs. For example, I'm going to throw out a plug here for Natasha Crane's new book that's coming out on 30 conversations to have with your kid about Jesus. And in that, a lot of the questions take this approach that you're talking about. They step back and ask questions about, okay, well, here's what the Bible says. So what do we ask about that claim, or what do we look at from the outside as to how this sounds to people? This sounds, crazy to someone, or this sounds, out of the realm of possibility. So what can we do to get there? What are we actually looking at here? And you look at it from that outside angle of how it looks. And like you said, you take that and you see if it comports to reality as you look at it deeper. So, but it's all from that starting point of looking at it from the outside. And I think Christians can build up their own beliefs that way, because honestly, if what we believe is true, then we need to have no fear of really exploring and investigating our beliefs.
Yeah. No, and I would. It's Sean McDowell tells this story of when he's growing up, he's a teenager or a young adult, and he starts to have doubts about the Bible or his faith or so forth. And so he comes to his father, Josh McDowell, who's a fairly well-known apologist, at least for his day. And, starts to express the doubts to his dad. And his dad's like, no, it's good to have those doubts and definitely explore them. And so his dad actually unlike a lot of Christian parents or Christian environments, which would try to shut down those doubts right on the offset, his dad was actually encouraging him to definitely sit down, do the work, investigate the doubts, and to do that on his own, not necessarily by just going to the echo chamber of the church and, hearing what everybody else has to say, but actually sit down and do that exploration on his own. And he ended up, staying Christian.
Right.
Yeah, but if you never get out there and investigate, I know you know this, and we've talked about it in some of the deconversion discussions, then, things don't always go that well if you never really back up or look for, why do you actually believe the way you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all right. And that's me. Caleb, you said that you could kind of transition from that?
Yeah, just a little bit. So we've talked about this somewhat in the past, but what I wanted to touch on is a little bit more of an insider test instead of an outsider test.
Okay.
As someone who researches fairly deeply into cults, Christian cults as well as other cults, and one of the things I've always done is I've studied a lot of various religions in comparison to Christianity. So looking at them from a outsider perspective, but also trying to take my mind and step back and look at it from a insider perspective on the religion as well. I find this helps to, look for those pitfalls that may come from their own theology, or to look at how their theology explains some of the more crazy claims they may have. So one I've been most recently exploring is actually witchcraft and Wicca and paganism. So I'm going to lump all those kind of together for the sake of tonight. And one of the reasons I've been looking at this and exploring it in a bit more depth is because back last year, of course, around October, as we were approaching Halloween, a lot of articles came out online in regards to the growth of Wicca and witchcraft as a religion in America. So this is something that was around October. It came out because specifically witches had outnumbered Presbyterians in the U.S. and seems to be on a continued growth spurt. So with that being the case, it's become a subject of interest for me in why this could be the case. And the last couple weeks, I've been reading a fairly popular work that had come out on Wicca in the 80s from Scott Cunningham. I think it's called something along the lines of Wicca for the solo practitioner, or something like that. As far as I can tell, it's a relatively well-known work in those circles. And in looking at the belief system from the inside a little bit, I've come to find that there are some real clear reasons as to why it's gained such popularity in the last few years in particular. So to kind of jump into this discussion on why I think some of those reasons are, and that's kind of where we're going to focus tonight. But again, this is taking an insider test, if you will, of looking at the view from the inside and seeing what it explains about what's going on culturally, or how the religion plays out from the inside as is. So with the current trends among Wicca, before we kind of dive into that, do you guys have any thoughts on what some of the current cultural, social trends for the millennial generation in particular have kind of been? What are some of the kind of key political, social, economical issues that have kind of come to the forefront and are even touted as dings on Christianity when it goes against some of these things?
So my thought on this is that you have a cultural push against Christianity, more, less because of the ridiculous claims and more because of the cultural values. So, the West was more or less founded on Judeo-Christian values, but as the country secularizes, well, as the Western world secularizes, the truth claims of Christianity, I'm sorry, the cultural values, not truth claims, but the values of Christianity become less of a foundation for, what we accept. And the culture has really become atomized. So, the prevailing philosophy of culture prior to, say, 1960s was that the individual existed for the good of the community, and then that gradually morphed into this idea that the community existed for the good of the individual. So, the world is responsible to me, and if the world is not treating me in the way that it should, there has to be some kind of move away from that. Well, that worked against Christianity because it was the so-called moral majority. And so when you were talking about fighting against the man, or rebelling against the world or so forth, you were really talking about going against these Judeo-Christian values that had sort of been the foundation at that time. And then sort of this traditionalism or conservatism, to a degree, hails back to kind of a standard. You're trying to preserve all of these values and traditions and so forth from the past. You're trying to keep those in place. But when those are viewed as kind of the bad things and change is the good thing, then anybody who's embracing those values is working against advancement of society. And so there's this fight against traditional values, which just so happen to be kind of Judeo-Christian values. And so as a result of this, there's been a push against religion as currently understood in the West, because religion is very much impacted, if nothing else, by Judeo-Christian values. I mean, the ones that you have them talking against are the Abrahamic religions, which, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, which all in some way borrow from these classic Old Testament writings. They all kind of share that in common, if nothing else. And so at some point you're rejecting them, but there's still this sort of need that human beings have for some level of kind of a spirituality, or this kind of I wouldn't even put it as spirituality, this call to the transcendent. We can't live, materialism or naturalism isn't a livable worldview because we have this sort of intuition or desire to have some kind of transcendent values or beliefs or goals. And so you have to find something that replaces these Judeo-Christian values and outlooks. And so there's this push towards things like New Age, things like spiritualism, things like Eastern beliefs, and things like paganism. So that's just one of the menu of options that you get to kind of maintain a spiritualism while rejecting Judeo-Christianity.
Yeah. I would absolutely agree with that, and I think there are some factors at play currently that make these things come together in such a way that accounts for a lot of the growth we're seeing in this sense. Clinton, did you have anything you wanted to jump in and say? Any thoughts on what some of the leading kind of cultural, social issues that Joe's alluding to here may be?
Yeah, possibly. I don't know if necessarily this is one that Joel had in mind, although it might be, because I haven't really looked too much into cultic religions or some of the other religions, specifically Wicca, witchcraft, paganism, those kinds of things. But I have encountered people who hold to these belief systems, especially in my own pro-life work. There's a pro-life association of paganists and of Wiccans and things like that. And the ones that I've encountered, one of the things I think they tend to have in common is that they care very deeply about animal rights. And many of them tend to be vegans, because of it. And so I think the issue of animal rights is one that's very important to people who hold to these belief systems.
If I could jump,
And
piggyback on that for just a second.
sure.
This also plays very heavily into environmentalism, which, politically, this has become kind of a platform to stand on if you want to base anything in sort of this moral value. You kind of end up doing the Greta Thunberg or whatever her name was, and
How dare you?
exactly, and piggybacking that onto environmentalism. We're facing some kind of crisis environmentally, and so every moral value you have can somehow stand on this environmental crisis. So yeah, animal rights, but in general, the earth, if you will. Paganism has always been kind of this worship of nature, and so you see it. And you could say that we're having this environmental crisis and so forth, and you can't just take that crisis and say paganism. But at some level, there definitely are pagan values that are starting to emerge based around this push towards environmentalism.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably, we're never going to get to the chicken and the egg question here as to which came first. But I think just the cultural move at this point is really drawing these two things together, and y'all touched on a couple of them. So I think animal rights are a big one, as we've seen over the last 15 years with the widespread social media, as well as the growth of YouTube and that sort of thing. It really does bring out some of these atrocities that are going on in meat factories and dairy farms and all that stuff. And so that certainly makes people feel compassionate for these animals, and that definitely brings about some animal rights issues that people get very passionate about. And the same thing with environmentalism, in terms of the earth has to be protected and is important above all other socioeconomic divergences of money we could possibly do, and that if we're not doing anything to protect the earth, then what are we doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think those are two very important issues, and I think that Wicca grabs onto those things in such a way that it is very respectful in terms of animal life and in terms of the planet, environmentally as well. These are two things that are very important in the Wicca religion.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, a couple other things I noted as kind of studying that came up that I think really kind of play well with the culture right now is there's a different view of God, in the sense of, and I think the reason why so many people have drifted towards it is their view of God alone is one that many Christians hold more to, even though they don't want to kind of won't say admit it, but they're unaware that their belief is theologically incorrect, and they gravitate this way well before they may ever make a switch to being Wiccan. And that is that it's this idea that you have an impact on God, in the sense of your prayers and your requests are things that God needs to answer, or is responsible for answering. So it's this, God is my deity to use, versus God is the omnipotent creator who owes me nothing. So I think that's one thing, is their view of God is something that a lot of Christians have already drifted towards in terms of their actions. And we see this particularly with the New Apostolic Reformation, which we've talked about in the past, as well as the prosperity gospel is huge in terms of it's all about name it and claim it, and you make this prayer and then you're going to get this. And it carries through Wiccan theology in very much the same way. There's this idea of a threefold return. So if you do something good, you're going to get 3 times back for that. So it's very much works based in terms of, the good I do is going to get me stuff back. So I think we've seen this seep into the church, and we definitely see it in popular culture as well. So in addition to some of those issues, there's a strong feminist aspect to Wicca, which is also something that is culturally very important to people, especially in the progressive Christian camp. You see this individuality being pushed so much, and I think that's something that could be said of about any culture, but in particular, being in a place where selfies are a thing and where, social media is all the rage, a religion that plays to your individuality, and one in which it's really all about you and the way you want to do things, even to the point of being relativistic, in that there is no one truth, no one way, but it's all about your particular recipe of this religion. So it's a lot of factors, I think, coming into play before you even kind of throw the icing on the cake with things like sexuality, which in Wicca is another key element, not in any one given flavor of sexuality, but sexuality is very much a worship, a ritual. Sex magic is a thing where you're using sex as a way to control and get what you want, and as a actual magic in balancing the universe and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
I've very much parodied that. I'm sure nobody would, as a Wiccan, would probably describe sex magic quite like that. But the point is, it's very individually driven, and it's very much all about me. And sex is a huge part of this religion in a lot of ways. Go ahead. You had a thought?
I have many thoughts, but I'll let you finish first.
So the point just kind of is a lot of where our culture has reached at this point, particularly as you go into a more progressive mentality, from the way Christianity's drifted into progressivism and prosperity gospel and that sort of thing. A lot of those elements that have become important in culture, even, individual respect and such as being the highest moral values. So, you do no harm to anybody else being a key value of morality. And I'm not denying that it isn't important, but everything kind of culturally has lined up at a point where Wicca fits very nicely into that, in terms of being a religion people could gravitate towards, and it matches up with those views that they may already hold, coming from a progressive Christian background or even a non-religious background. It's something that's going to give them that spiritual fulfillment that you mentioned, while also meshing nicely with a lot of where their worldview stands already.
Yeah, so you know this because I pointed it out to you, but recently I'm seeing more of this trend of people of atheist witches, if you will. So people move from kind of from say Christianity, and they move into witchcraft while maintaining atheism. And as you're talking, it's becoming clear why this is to me, because really, if you're a naturalist or a materialist, um, paganism is like the perfect religion for you. So there's this moment in scripture, in the creation narrative, where God kind of fashions a man out of dirt and then breathes into him, and he becomes a living soul, is sort of how the text describes it. And, in that moment, you kind of see this idea where, to a degree, the man's mother is earth. Earth gives him his body, and then God gives him his spirit. So, this would be the dualist view of human nature, where we have a spiritual aspect to us and we have a physical aspect to us. And the physical aspect is material, and the spiritual aspect is inherited directly from God. But if you get rid of the spiritual aspect, if you say that we're purely material, if you take the naturalist aspect, or I'm sorry, the naturalist philosophy, then paganism basically spiritualizes the material.
Right.
We are descended from Mother Earth. We are nothing but material, but then paganism gives us the option of worshiping material, or that material is to some extent spiritual in kind of a weird way. So yeah, I mean, I can see why this move towards paganism aligns with sort of a naturalist worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point.
I'm hailing back to that point a bit. There's this idea that you see from the atheist camp that Christians don't really care about the world because we're all about the afterlife, etc. But in the text itself, there's sort of this responsibility to the world that comes about because we are in fact material. We do exist in a material world. We have a body, and we were called to care for the material world. So, and even in our sort of eschatological, eschatological, I don't know, the end times, let's call it, ideas, doctrines, philosophies, however you want to say it. It's not this notion that a lot of people have of just kind of going up to an airy spiritual world in the clouds and just kind of living there eternally. There's a recreation of the physical world, and there's a resurrection of the physical body. So, I mean, we're not leaving this physical world and never coming back. We're permanent residents of the physical world that take a vacation, if you will.
So would you say that we are spirits in a material world?
I would say that we're both. We're material and we're spirits, and I would say that's probably the difference between humans and angels, is that humans are both material and immaterial, but not to be separated.
So
I mean,
so no police fans in the podcast with me?
No, sorry.
All right.
You're the music guy, remember? Yeah, right over my head.
Yeah, that's a song by the Police. Is Spirits in the Material World.
Okay. All right. I'm with you.
That'll be our theme song for the week then.
There you go. Yeah.
All right.
If only it could come up in Love Song, Worship Song as well.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Well, I can't use it now.
That's true.
Thanks a lot, Clinton.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. Well,
so yeah. Any other thoughts, Clinton? Did you have any thoughts regarding the paganism rising and this meshing of culture with a niche kind of religion that just fits real well?
No, I have nothing really to add that hasn't been said already.
And
like I said, it's really an area that I've looked into much.
That's fair enough. Honestly, studied some, but it hasn't been deep enough up until now to really see kind of why this trend has played out the way it has. And I think that, you know, looking into the theology, there's some valid reasons to see why people would gravitate towards this. And kind of the point in bringing all this up to inform people and give them this information. But the other point is to really hone in on what your theology is, because if you're in one of these churches that leans towards progressive Christianity, or if you're in a place where, you know, the New Apostolic Reformation is a big deal, you know, theology matters, because, you know, Joel is the expert on deconversion. But if gradually your views change and you're being pulled kind of further and further away from traditional Christian values that are legitimately supported by the Bible, then you're going to be more likely to drift into another religion entirely if it matches up better with the worldview and values that you've kind of crafted around yourself. And Wicca really fits that well. So, you know, get your theology straight as much as you can. Study, stay in Scripture, so that, you know, if your values do shift and change, it's based on what the Bible says and based on God's revealed word to us, versus being based on what the culture says or what maybe a friend or family member's values are.
Yeah. You know, it's always been interesting to me that, you know, when you see the atheist world, as it were, the community, they always focus very specifically on Christianity. I mean, you might occasionally have one that's addressing things like, I don't know, UFOs or telekinesis or, you know, whatever the paranormal stuff.
Right.
Did we just lose Joel?
It's always very specific to Christianity.
Sorry, I cut you out there for a second, sir.
Oh,
I saw it.
I was wondering what happened there.
All right. Well, sounds like we're ready to wrap up then.
All right. You have anything else to say to take us out?
Clinton?
No, I think we've, you know, covered as much as I know. So.
All right. Well, in that case, you've been listening to / watching The Mentionables, and we're happy to bring you these presentations. It looks like weekly now, which is great. If you want to support us in any way, leave a review or a thumbs up, depending on where you're listening to. If you're listening to the video, start leaving some responses in the comments, and we'll start responding to those. We don't get a lot of responses to our show, and we always love those and like to interact with them. Also,
here's one.
Oh, you want to read it?
Oh, you want me to read it?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. From Air Church says, I just wanted to say that I'm enjoying your discussion.
Oh, okay. All right.
You can't see the things that come up on the screen, can you?
Yeah, I can't. Not from the platform I'm working off of.
All right.
Well, we're always glad to have listeners, and we love listener questions too. So
yeah.
I've got to give a shout out to a new Patreon member. But for some reason, it's giving me a hard time logging into Patreon. So in the meantime, we've got a Facebook page.
And
it's
I love
pretty
you,
active.
citizen.
You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Those are probably the most active things we've got going. We have an Instagram account, but I've never seen it. So it's either being maintained by someone else or no one at all.
Yeah.
Also, we continue to watch our YouTube channel as well, because we'll be leaving some more. We're trying to get more videos launched on there. And oh yeah, I was going to talk about Patreon since I'm looking up this patron. So our Patreon account is pretty active now. We're wrapping up the audio version of one of our audiobooks. And after that, there's a good chance that we might be mailing our members, our patrons, some special goodie. So now would be a good time to jump on if you want to get that. And I finally have the Patreon member that I'd like to give a shout out to, Brett Clark. Thanks for joining the team. We really appreciate your patronage, and we're trying to make quality material specifically for you. All right. So you've been watching the Mentionables. Please visit us on thementionables.org.